Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. A soldier who shot dogs eating human corpses in Iraq returns to domestic life in suburbia. A chaplain finds his Christianity inadequate and his ability to provide solace tested. A young Foreign Service officer is given the absurd task of helping Iraqis improve their lives by teaching them baseball. An adjutant who tears up as he writes citation letters for the dead or has to inform a father and mother that their child is no more. The soldier, the chaplain, the Foreign Service officer, and the adjutant are 4 of the 12 narrators in Phil Klay's National Book Award collection of short stories, Redeployment. Phil served 13 months in Iraq as a public information officer during the surge in 2007-2008. He's a CUNY alumnus who, after his commitment ended, received a Master's of Fine Arts at Hunter College. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you for having me.
The book is a true revelation. I learned more about Iraq and sort of my feelings toward Iraq by reading this more than anything else I've read or viewed. So I thank you.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, and it reminds me of Picasso. Art is a lie to tell the truth. You are a masterful liar, sir. Okay.
I try to be.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
And it works. Okay, so fabulous reviews, National Book Award, praise from President Obama, and an encounter with Stephen Colbert. Talk about your reaction to the Obama praise of the book. Odd?
It's a surreal moment if you've written a book about war, specifically a book asking the reader to imagine the experience of people on the ground level in war, to then have the commander-in-chief read that book and talk about it. So that was definitely a surreal...
A trip.
Yeah, moment.
Stephen Colbert, what's it like? And you want to communicate to folks about this.
Absolutely.
And it worked with Colbert. Talk about Colbert, how it worked, your reaction, etc.
Well, I mean, it was great to be asked to be on the show and
a little bit of a thrill, huh?
Sure,
cultural icon.
Yeah, and I admire his show, and he's a tremendous performer. So it was both fun, and I thought that it was a good conversation that we were able to have.
What about his persona? He was. I think part of the subject matter made him less acerbic than he usually is. I mean, he took this seriously, and in most cases, he doesn't.
Well, he's always been quite serious about matters of war and the military and the troops, and I think that's important to him.
Okay. The title of the book is interesting in itself when you actually read it, because it's not only about the multiple tours of duty that these combatants face, but redeployment home, returning stateside, which was real interesting element of the book. And in your very first story, Redeployment, the title story, Sergeant Price is back from Iraq. Give us a little bit of background, and then let's go directly to the sergeant.
Okay, yeah, sure. So the first story is important for me for that to be the first story. It laid out some of the things that I wanted to talk about in the collection as a whole.
Now, is that the first story that you actually wrote?
It's the first story I wrote. The first line is the first line I ever wrote. So
how long after the first line was the last line written?
It took me about 2.5 years to finish the story.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you have that with several of the stories, or some of them came quick, but most of them took?
All the stories took a long time. I rewrite stories a lot. I have a lot of friends read work as I'm as I'm writing. I read books to try and better inform me about what I'm talking, what I want to talk about.
A lot of research went into it, obviously.
Sure.
Okay.
Interviews with Marines. So it everything takes a long time. And this is, I'm going to read a section from the story. He's been in the Second Battle of Fallujah, which was incredibly intense urban combat, and he's just returned home. And this is, I think, their first weekend back. So here's an experience. Your wife takes you shopping in Wilmington. Last time you walked down a city street, your Marine on point went down the side of the road, checking ahead and scanning the roofs across from him. The Marine behind him checks the windows on the top levels of the buildings. The Marine behind him gets the windows a little lower, and so on down, until your guys have the street level covered, and the Marine in back has the rear. In a city, there's a million places they can kill you from. It freaks you out at first, but you go through like you were trained, and it works. In Wilmington, you don't have a squad, you don't have a battle buddy, you don't even have a weapon. You startle 10 times checking for it, and it's not there. You're safe, so your alertness should be at white, but it's not. Instead, you're stuck in a American Eagle Outfitters. Your wife gives you some clothes to try on, and you walk into the tiny dressing room, you close the door, and you don't want to open it again. Outside, there are people walking around by the windows like it's no big deal. People have no idea where Fallujah is, where 3 members of your platoon died. People who spent their whole lives at white. They'll never get even close to orange.
Wow. Now, did you, as a returning Marine, even though you are a public information officer and you really don't have combat stories, did you feel that same sort of dislocation, culture shock, whatever it is?
So I didn't feel what he's feeling right there.
Yeah.
I certainly experienced dislocation. So, yeah, I mean, it's very strange to come back from a place where people are dying, right? To a culture that seems very disconnected from the fact that we're at war, particularly it's the culture that sent you over, right? In the middle of my deployment, I went home to New York. You get 2 weeks leave, you do a year. And, I was not in combat, I was a public affairs officer. But I lived near a trauma facility, so I'd seen a Marine die there, and I'd seen a lot of, people come through. It was people right from the battlefield, Marines, insurgents, Iraqi police, civilians. When there was a suicide truck bombing in the first month, we brought a bunch of people in. And so I'd seen this happen and then flew back to New York and was walking down Madison Avenue thinking, what is this place? Right? And why isn't anybody paying attention? And that feeling continued for me, not so much when I came back to Lejeune, because then I was in a community that really was entirely centered around war, because there are small pockets of the country that are at war. Mm-hmm. But when I got out of the Marine Corps, went back to Iraq, and was a veteran living in New York, and it's very easy for me not to pay attention, except that if you're a vet, people who are going over time and time again.
Right. So there are 12 stories, and each is told in the first person by a different narrator.
Yes.
Which, to me, was a very effective approach because you have very, very different voices. And you have, I don't know if you were telling the reader that not even these dozen stories begin to capture the full element of what's going on. But looking at it through 12 different eyes really allowed the reader, me in particular here, to see it, to begin to imagine it, even though we've always lived in white.
Right.
And how did you come to that particular style in terms of presenting your various thoughts?
So originally I was working on a novel alongside the collection of stories, but very quickly I realized that the stories were actually the right way to go.
Uh-huh.
And I discarded the novel. Though there was some writing there that I liked. And, there's so many different Iraqs, right? And when you come back and people ask, what was it like? What was going on there? You feel empowered as a veteran to tell them. And yet my Iraq was not Sergeant Price's Iraq, and his Iraq was not the adjutant's Iraq. And so instead of, having one continuous narrative telling you what it was, I wanted to have 12 narratives that didn't necessarily match up, right? That, 12 narrators who might not necessarily agree with each other if you put them in a room.
Right.
And that to open up some space for the reader to start to look at what kind of claims these guys are making, and also hopefully to imagine the broader world, because it's not possible to be comprehensive, and certainly this isn't, they're all male narrators,
right.
Military families
right.
are talked about, or anything like that.
How many stories did you actually write? How many are in the drawer besides these dozen? Because there seems that there are a couple of other stories out there that you must have written.
Sure. Yeah, there are some stories in the drawer. I don't know how many. And there are a lot of stubs or just things that never went anywhere.
Sure.
But when I was writing the book, for me, it wasn't a series of one-offs, right? There were pieces that I knew I wanted to hit. So at a certain point, I had a general notion. You work kind of by feel, but the shape I wanted, and some of the pieces that were missing. And then I do a lot of reading and research in order to be able to write those pieces. So, for example, I knew that I wanted something that expanded a little bit outward and showed you some of the policy decisions that had been made. So I came up with the idea of having it from a Foreign Service officer's perspective.
Talk about that particular piece and what it meant, because in some senses that's the most political of, in a narrow sense,
sure.
of what you've written, even though it's all political in the largest sense. Go ahead.
So I knew I wanted to set a story dealing with the Reconstruction effort, right? And I read books. There's a memoir by a Foreign Service officer called We Met Well. I read Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction reports, including Hard Lessons, which is a long and enraging read of just kind of a after-action report of all the mistakes that were made and what could be done better. I had friends who had worked in the region, actually, that story is set, had stories about going out to a water treatment plant from a base called Istiqlal, which was supposed to be named Peace or Freedom, or Liberation, but we screwed it up, So I gathered all these things together and then tried to fashion a narrative out of it. And then the other thing that I was reading at the time was a book by a Czech anarchist from World War I called The Good Soldier Schweik. And that kind of gave me the I don't know, it sparked something for me when writing the book, and then tried to fashion a narrative that would combine a couple of elements that would show some of the things that had happened. So one was the baseballs.
Talk about the baseballs. I mean, this seemed to me almost, it is archetypal Americana. Go ahead. What's going on? The baseball uniforms come. Go ahead.
So there's a wealthy constituent of a congressman.
And the mattress king of northern Kansas.
The mattress king of northern Kansas. And his thought is that baseball is the perfect thing for Iraq, that you need to change the culture, and that baseball is like the pure sport of democracy, that, it's a series of, it's like individual achievement, but you're part of a team, and all this other stuff about baseball that he thinks is just, and they're into soccer, and he thinks that teaches you all the wrong lessons.
Right. Sports diplomacy.
Yeah, sports diplomacy, which was the thing that people talked about. And, so this Foreign Service officer gets tasked with this basically to get this congressman off of their backs.
Right.
And the thing that really matters to him is this water treatment plant. And so there was, in fact, and there's all kinds of things that are wrong with this. We put millions into it, but it's rusted, and clearly all that money has been siphoned off. The ministry is never going to turn it on because the pipes go to a Sunni community, and it's run, the ministry is run by the Shia. And then at the same time, the pipes are too big, and so even if they ever got it to work, it would blow up all the toilets in the region. The thing is, it's based on a real incident.
The mismanagement.
Right.
In this one short story, you can get money for these absolutely bogus jobs programs, but you can't get money for a health clinic. It was a mess.
And so part of what that is him coming in, and there's this major who he at first thinks is an idiot, who then realizes sort of later in the story, this guy is actually very canny at manipulating the absurdity of the bureaucracy to actually do a few small good things. And that's kind of the arc of the story, of him learning to embrace the insanity of the bureaucracy such that he can actually do at least a little bit.
A catch-22.
Right.
And there were the book is full of these catch-22. What did you learn from your characters? They've taught you something. What did you learn from them? And who taught you the most important lessons?
I learned a lot from them. I think if you'd asked me about Iraq when I first came back, I'd have much more certainty about it. I've got a lot more questions now. I think one of the things that the characters did was they undermined a lot of the ideas that I'd had. You start out, at least for me, I start out with a notion of how the world works or how this world will work. And then you try and put it into a story. And as you try and make the characters more real, they end up undermining your ideas.
Right.
So each one was a slow process of trying to bring the characters out and allow them to, take charge of the story more.
It sounds like for you, it's really a series of surprises, and they've helped you figure out some stuff. How does I've talked to one of your mentors, Colin McCann. How does the character talk to you? How does the character affect the author?
It depends on the story. It depends on the person, right? How did the chaplain affect you? You're a Catholic. You went to a premier Catholic high school, and there's Catholicism both directly and indirectly throughout all of this. Talk about that. So the chaplain is, that story is about a lot of things. It's about bad leadership.
Awful.
And the consequences of that at the ground level. There's this chaplain who has a young infantryman come to him and suggest that maybe some of the guys in his unit have been killing civilians, right? Or at the very least being trigger happy. Mm-hmm. And he's not 100% sure what exactly is going on, but there's one guy who died in very strange circumstances. Mm-hmm. And the chaplain is trying to do something about this, despite the fact that he doesn't actually have any real power to change the situation. And he's trying to influence a command that's overly aggressive, that's very much about killing people. They have a bad battalion commander, and then one of the companies has a very bad company commander. And a sort of lack of leadership in one of the platoons because one of the platoon commanders was killed early on. And at the same time, it's the chaplain asking himself all these questions about his own faith,
right,
as he's grappling with the issues that this battalion is dealing with.
Let's go to the chaplain in one of the more remarkable passages from his journal. Go ahead.
So, I'd at least thought there would be nobility in war. I know it exists. There's so many stories, and some of them have to be true. But I see mostly normal men trying to do good, beaten down by horror, by their inability to quell their own rages, by their masculine posturing and their so-called hardness, their desire to be tougher, and therefore crueler than their circumstance. And yet, I have this sense that this place is holier than back home. Gluttonous, fat, oversexed, over-consuming materialist home, where we're too lazy to see our own faults. At least here, Rodriguez has the decency to worry about hell.
Pretty sharp stuff, probably among the sharpest cultural observations in the book, at least manifest. You feel that way?
So one of the things about, writing that story in particular, I was reading a book alongside this, Georges Bernano's Diary of a Country Priest. It's a beautiful novel about a country priest. And, the stakes are absolutely as high in that book as in any of my stories. Nobody's dying, but they're moral stakes. The same moral decisions that are made in peacetime are made in war. It's not some other realm of human experience, but the consequences are so dire. It becomes so much more existentially important to figure it out, and that's what he's grappling with there. That in this place, these questions are they're both life and death, and there was a Vietnam veteran who was talking about a unit that had done war crimes, and he was saying that he was with, and the people that he was with had kind of got this sense like we could die any moment, so it didn't matter what we did. And then he said, but the longer that I was over there, the more I realized that because I could die, that it was in fact the opposite. I could die any moment, and therefore it mattered even more what I did. And that's the apprehension that the narrator is having.
Okay. Stepping back, there are 12 stories, but throughout the stories is the centrality of stories.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're sad stories, as one character says, and sometimes they're happy stories, and he tells you about the nature of those stories. But part of what I got out of reading the stories was the importance of the stories, because the story is you.
Yes. And it's you go over to war with all the stories about war that you've heard, all the stories that you want to live up to, all the stories that you read to prepare yourself or talk about, all the movies you've seen, and then you experience what you experience. You try and make sense of it at the time using stories, and then you come back not just to the stories that you're telling yourself, but also to the stories that other people are telling about you. And one of the things that happens is, in this book, people will come back and they'll have an experience that's very particular, that they have a complex range of experience about. And they'll encounter people who have a very definite understanding of what that person must have been through that frequently doesn't match up.
Right.
And then it's how do you actually have a conversation with somebody? How do you reach out so that you can, so the person can talk about it and start to figure it out in their own head, and also reach out and have a real communion with another, human being.
Sure. Larger questions here. You've said that you've written this work to stimulate a conversation, and clearly there are other veterans and others who are involved in this, and this is part of that conversation. What do we need to understand coming out of this conversation? What's the lesson?
Well, there's no one lesson, but I think that the biggest thing for me is a moral engagement with our wars.
And it's our wars.
Our wars.
It's not only your war, the 1%, but it's the 100%.
Yeah, it's not Bush's war. It's not Obama's war now. It's our war.
Okay. And then, again, it's not overtly political, but has the U.S. used its military power in an appropriate way, if I may use that word? I mean, moral way, any way, or suspend judgment?
Well, no, there are periods where we made disastrously bad decisions. And, we're...
To some of us, almost all of them, but that's okay.
And then there are periods where the policy got better. I mean, certainly the early invasion and a lot of the decisions that were made early on in the war are mind-boggling now when you look at them.
And you served during the surge, so when you left, it was more of a period of optimism that this thing could be
violence went down tremendously.
Unbelievably. Yeah. So the time that you were there, not only where you were, both psychologically and geographically, but time mattered a lot.
Sure, absolutely. You know, if I had left in 2006, I probably would have felt very different about the war than leaving in the beginning of 2008, having witnessed, I mean, just a tremendous decline in violence in that province. So, you know, and then of course, you know, veterans from that time have watched the situation unravel.
Sure.
And it's, you know, I mean, you talk about the Iraq War, you're talking about, I mean, over a decade of policy at this point.
Yep. Okay. The last reading, the last 2 pages really are among the most, I don't know, tear-inducing, if you will, goosebump-raising. Could you just read this?
The narrative of the story is part of a artillery unit, and they fired their first real mission at actual targets, but because it's part of a 9-man team on a howitzer, they shoot at targets very far away. They don't actually see the damage that they've done, and he's trying to figure out: has he killed people? Is he responsible for that? What does it mean? And he would like to be able to actually see the damage that he's done, but he can't. And so he's walking around base, and then he sort of remembers this moment earlier. Not when he'd seen, you know, sort of the bodies of insurgents or people that they'd killed, but something very different. We'd been going to chow, all of Gun 6, laughing and joking until Sergeant Dietz, who was yelling something about the Spartans being gay, stopped mid-sentence. He froze and shifted straight into his full height and whispered, "Atan, hut!" We all snapped to attention, not knowing why. Sergeant Dietz raised his right hand in a salute, and so did we. Then I saw, off in the distance, well down the road, 4 corpsmen coming out of Fallujah Surgical carrying a stretcher draped with the American flag. Everything was silent, still. All down the road, Marines and sailors had snapped too. I could barely see it in the early morning light. I strained my eyes looking at the outline of the body under the thick fabric of the flag, and then the stretcher passed from view. Now, standing there in the daytime, looking at the 2 corpsmen in the smoke pit, I wonder if they'd been the ones carrying the body. They must have carried some. Everyone standing on the road as the body went past had been so utterly silent, so still. There was no sound or movement except for the slow steps of the corpsman and the steady progress of the corpse. It'd been an image of death from another world. But now I know where that corpse was headed, to the old gunny at PRP. And if there was a wedding ring, the gunny would have slowly worked it off the stiff, dead fingers. He would have gathered all the personal effects and prepared the body for transport. Then it would have gone by air to TQ. And as it was unloaded off the bird, the Marines would have stood silent and still, just as we had in Fallujah. And they would have put it on a C-130 to Kuwait. And they would have stood silent and still in Kuwait. And they would have stood silent and still in Germany, and silent and still at Dover Air Force Base. Everywhere it went, Marines and sailors and soldiers and airmen would have stood at attention as it traveled to the family of the fallen, where the silence, the stillness, would end.
Thanks to Phil Klay and his remarkable National Book Award-winning short story collection, Redeployment, for helping us imagine the unimaginable. Join us next week here on CUNY TV. Excellent. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.